Hello and welcome back to a new season in World of Tanks Blitz. It is now season 5, so there are 3 new tanks to grind throughout the next 3 months by doing in-game activities, and the first one you'll get is this. It is the Hazard 1. It is a tier 7 medium tank in the Hybrid Nation. The next tank you'll get after it, after grinding through all of these modules, is the Quetzal. It is this tank. It's a tier 8 heavy tank, and then after grinding this one you'll get to the Argonaut, which is this tier 9 tank destroyer. For how to get these tanks, the Hazard 1 is completely for free. You just have to complete some activities throughout the season. For example, in the Battle Pass every month you can get 1,300 of the season currency for free. Of course, if you pay and buy the Battle Pass, you can get an extra 2,600 in each one. And that will increase your progression to getting the tank. But the tier 7 is easy for all players to get, really. You just have to play the game a bit, do some in-game activities like the Battle Pass, completing some rating battles, or if you play tournaments, and you can also get them from other things in the store and purchases like that. So anyway, getting into the stats of this tank, I'll first show the armor. So here is its armor against 160mm of armor piercing on this side, and on the other side it will be premium ammo, 208 APCR. So against 160mm of AP, you can see that it actually has really nice frontal armor. Its turret is completely red, and though it does have a weak spot on top, it is quite small. As you can see here, it is a really thin, narrow target to be shooting at, and with AP that's even more difficult. And just to show the effect of enhanced armor, one thing that's really nice on this tank is that it will make this green area on the roof an auto ricochet to 75mm guns. It doesn't for the gun it's shooting right now, because this is a 100mm gun, but if you look here, you can see that the roof up here is not penetrable, and this is from the T23E3's 75mm. So that is something quite nice if you used enhanced armor. On top of this, you can see that the lower plate has an auto ricochet angle, which means that no matter how high penetration, it won't penetrate through the lower plate. It's roughly 150mm thick, so heat rounds can go through it, but due to its angle again, and if you turn the hull a bit, it will still be quite challenging. The upper plate is 150 to 350, and that is just getting stronger and stronger the more you go up, because it is just a solid 100mm plate. So you can see here this is using heat, which doesn't normalize. At the bottom it starts 120mm, go further up 180, further up 200, 280, and 400mm there. You can also see there's some small weak points, this driver hatch in the middle, and on the side above the tracks there are other weak points. They are quite challenging to shoot at because it's like threading a needle. You have to try and avoid hitting all the red around it, and try and avoid not missing this thin area. So against armor piercing, you can see the armor is quite good against same tier tanks, and especially against lower tier tanks. Switching to premium ammo, this is 208mm of APCR. You can see the lower plate is still an auto ricochet, it's not penetrable. The upper plate is a little bit more grey, but again, as you could see with this view, it just gets stronger and stronger because it's all one same thickness. And it will just keep going up the further up on the hull you go. So still, largely, the upper plate is still quite strong. It's just more of the lower part, the less angled bit, will be penetrable to premium rounds. And you can see on the turret face now, the turret cheeks are quite penetrable as they are flat, and the base thickness is 174mm, which will only bounce standard ammo from tier 6 and 7 tanks, and tier 8s will be able to penetrate through without using premium ammo. Tier 7s and 6s will need premium ammo for the turret, but Tier 8s won't. Here you can see the hull side. It looks red, but it is not. That is just an auto ricochet angle, and if you shoot the tracks, it will automatically penetrate due to the 3 caliber bypass or double overmatch rule, which will increase the normalization and just ignore the auto ricochet angle that is behind the tracks. So if you see the Hazard 1 turning its hull like this, you can just shoot the tracks and it will go in. It doesn't matter how big or small your gun is, as long as you aren't shooting heat or high explosive, then it will do a full penetration. Don't shoot around the gun. Even in this view, you can see it's quite hard to try and thread the needle between the top of the turret and the bottom of the turret. As you can see, these areas are 250 to 390 millimeters thick because they are just so well angled. So you have to try and just hit that small area there. You also can't hit the gun mantlet, as that is 300 millimeters thick, and it is spaced armor as well. So yeah, the Hazard 1's armor is actually very good. It feels very reliable when you play it in battle, and that's something that's just so nice and refreshing on this tank, as most Tier 7 mediums don't have this. Of course, if you want to view the armor profile on my website, you can. I've added this tank to the home page and to the Hybrid Nation section. So when using gun depression, you can see the lower part of the upper plate is hidden, so that area is no longer a weak point, but the turret front is still weak due to those cheeks. And you can see the driver's hatch right there is a weak point as well, though again, while enemies can penetrate it, it won't be a reliable shot because it's just such a small weak point to go for. You can also see the area above the tracks. If enemies are knowledgeable, then they might shoot there and it will penetrate. So now going into the weak points of the tank. These green areas are areas you can shoot with any enemy that faces the Hazard 1. So if you're Tier 6, you can shoot here and penetrate with no problem, even if you're a low penetration tank like the EZ8, which has 128 on AP. If you're shooting the cupola, it can be quite hard because you can see there's red up there and a bit on the edges, so it's also quite a small target, so it's not really worth going for that if you can shoot these other areas. I didn't highlight the driver's hatch weak point because I just forgot, but that is also a weak point right there. These yellow areas are for premium ammo. If you're a Tier 6 or 7 tank, you will need to use premium ammo to go through that, unless you are something like a Tiger 2, a Tiger 1 or a T29, which have really high base AP penetration. Tier 8s will also just be able to penetrate through these yellow areas, as Tier 8s have higher penetration than Tier 7s by quite a lot. So moving into its gun, it has a 100mm gun like tanks like the T44 or Type 59. So its damage on AP is 280, that is very nice in Tier 7. The only tanks that have more are the Mutant and tanks like the Sphere and Leo. On heat it's 240, that's average, there's nothing wrong with that. On HE it's 370, that's actually very nice because usually for 280 on AP the HE is 350, so you do have increased HE alpha, and that actually does make a big difference against tanks with Spall Liner. Reload of 7.9 is very nice, it has 2123 DPM. Compare this to Tier 8 tanks like the T44-100 that has a 7.7 second reload, so it's barely worse than a Tier 8 tank. And if you compare it to the Type 59, which has an 8 second reload, or the T54 Mod 1, which is like 8.1 or 8.2, this can actually out DPM those Tier 8 mediums. But it's worth noting that Tier 7 is a DPM tier, so most Tier 7s actually have very high DPM but low penetration. For example, the Comet T23E3, the M41D, tanks like those have great DPM but low penetration. And compared to those tanks in Tier 7, the Hazard 1 has quite low DPM but high alpha. And in terms of penetration, 156 on AP, 195 on heat. That is low, but that is normal for Tier 7. In Tier 7, this penetration is just average. but tier 7 as a whole just is a tier with low penetration levels. HE is 45, that is below average. Most 100mm guns do 50, but it's a trade-off you get for having extra alpha damage. Aim time is very nice. Again, consider this 280 alpha in tier 7 is actually very high, so having that fast aim time is great. Its base aim time as well is 1.58 when equipped, and again that is very good. You'll feel the gun aims in very quickly. Dispersion 0.34 or 0.289, again very good. Compare it to the CS52 Lease, the Leo, the Sphere, they all have 0.380 dispersion, so this is much better, much more accurate. On top of that, it has very good gun handling for this level of alpha damage. 0.14, 0.14, 0.12 is just very good. For example, if you look at the Sphere, it has 0.17, 0.17, and I believe 0.14. That's much worse than this, and this actually feels very accurate and very consistent in terms of how the gun handles in battle due to these stats. And of course, gun depression 8 degrees. That is very comfortable, very nice for especially this tank having its good armor. So next, the mobility. Top speed is 49, that's just average, that's nothing special. Reverse speed is 18, that is below average. Most mediums have 20, but 18 is not too bad at least. Traverse speed 66 is very high, that is actually very nice. And 51 on medium, that is still good, but it's less, and you'll see why that is with the terrain resistances. The acceleration rate is, hold on, 19.8. I made a typo here. It has a 1123 horsepower engine and it weighs 57 tons. Yes, this little tank, which is actually very small, fairly small, weighs almost 57 tons. It is 56.64 tons, which is massive. It weighs as much as a Chimera, and you can actually ram enemies for tons of damage due to this, and that's why it has such a strong engine. Actual acceleration rate is 19.8, almost 20, that is actually quite good for a tier 7 tank, and 15 on medium terrain, that isn't as good, it's more average or mediocre, but it's still decent, especially when you think this tank has good armor. So the reason for the much less sort of mobility performance on medium terrain is 1.3 terrain resistances. Most mediums generally have 1, 1.1, 1.2, or 1.1, 1.2. This tank with its 1 to 1.3 is significantly more noticeable, because that difference means that when you go off of hard terrain such as roads, concrete areas and paths, your mobility decreases quite a bit, and you can see that here, 66 to 51 degrees of traverse, that's a 15 degree traverse decrease, and 19.8 down to 15.3 is almost 5 horsepower per ton. Despite this, it's still good mobility. You have to remember this tank has good armor against any penetration level, because it just has these weird angles on its front of its hull and turret. So in terms of equipment, this is the setup I have, but that's just personal preference. I like having better aim time, but refined gun works very well on this tank because it does have good gun handling, as shown just now. You can use calibrated shells. Again, that works very well on this tank because it increases your standard penetration to 168, that's quite good for a tier 7, and its premium goes up to 220, again, quite good, since many tier 7 mediums won't use calibrated shells because many of them are DPM focused. Many tier 7s want to use gun rammer just to make their DPM better because they are DPM tanks. This one isn't. This has alpha damage to trade with, so you can easily just drop the gun rammer and have an 8.3 second reload while still having 2000 DPM, and your penetration can easily deal with heavier armoured tanks, which is a noticeable thing in battle. If you face some of the older premiums, for example, because they were balanced differently way back in 2014, 2015, you can't penetrate a Type 59 anywhere on the front if you have gun rammer, and you can't penetrate tanks like the IS-6, the IS-5, just and IS-3 as well. Just older sort of tanks which have stronger lower plates you can do absolutely nothing against if you're using gun rammer, and that's why calibrated shells is quite a good choice sometimes. However, I've gone with gun rammer because I like being able to out-reload some higher tier mediums and also still having quite competitive reload and DPM for my high alpha damage. So now I'll look at this stock tank because that is important. You get the tank stock, that's how it comes. It has all of these modules you have to go through, and these 4 are the ones you start with. You don't stay on them very long because immediately you upgrade the gun after about 100 or 200 of the season currency, and then very quickly you start getting these other modules. But I'll show the comparison anyway. So you can see the DPM increase is quite significant to the top version, but the stock version, still having 260 alpha with 8.6 second reload, it can still damage trade. Penetration is much worse, and that is very noticeable. 180 heat is just garbage. You will need to use calibrated shells if you want to have any chance of doing anything, even in tier 7, because 180 will even struggle against some tier 7 and tier 6 tanks. Its caliber is smaller, so it will overmatch less, but that's not that relevant. It still has great aim time, its dispersion is okay, it's still better than the other higher alpha tanks, and its gun handling doesn't change, that's pretty nice. Mobility is noticeably worse, but it's still not terrible considering this tank has armor, and you'll see in a minute its stock armor is actually better than the top armor. So you can see 14 horsepower per ton on medium terrain. It's low, but it's not unusable, and its fire chance has also gone up, which is a bit unfortunate. So you might want to consider having 2 repair kits if you usually like using a speed boost, which I have done here, but you might want to do this if it's stock or you see modules getting damaged often. So now looking at the armor. So this is the top turret. You can see against heat, 195mm. It has these penetrable weak points on the side, and it's got this cupola at the back. Here's the stock turret against the same level of penetration, and you can see how it changes. It has these cheeks on the side which are actually very well angled, but high penetration will still go through like tier 8 heavy tanks, and the turret cheek weak points are actually much smaller. Oops, I accidentally closed that page. But yeah, the turret cheek weak points are much smaller, as you can see here, against heat, and against AP it's still very strong, as you can see. It actually also loses that overmatch weak point, which is on the roof of the tank. The cupola is slightly larger, but it's not noticeable really. So the stock turret is actually quite good. You can be confident with this turret while using it in hull down gun depression positions and with just its general use in battle. Just try not to turn it because it does have those angled cheeks which will be sort of worse, as you can see like that. But you'll see the stock turret in the gameplay, which I will show. If I can just find it. So the first battle is on Faust. I'll say that both of these battles are top tier because of course that's where the tank works best and that's where it's easiest to get some footage of good battles. So this was my first game in the tank. I didn't really know what to expect of it because I'd only basically just checked the armor. I hadn't really checked the mobility or the gun too much. This gun also has some very nice stats on shell velocity. 1060 on AP means you can snapshot quite effectively and hit targets even at long range with relative accuracy. So here you can see I'm going to the usual medium position and going hull down. As this is a new tank, enemies will bounce off more often, so you have to remember that. But it does still show the armor. This tank, you have to remember, has a troll lower plate and a sort of upper plate which is quite well angled, meaning its lower plate that's actually penetrable is quite thin and hard to hit, and you can see the enemies just bouncing off. Here the AMX-12T decides to load gold, which is the right thing to do, and he kills my loader. Here you'll see me use the great high explosive shells against the Hellcat, which greatly increase the alpha damage of this tank, and you definitely should use them wherever possible. Even if enemies use Spore-Liner, the high explosive shells still do on average 20 more damage than your standard shell will.
Great shot.
So here I make a few bad shots against the T-26. Not particularly due to the gun's fault, just bad aiming on my part.
Didn't even scratch them.
And that's a bit of bad RNG there as I shoot the tracks and it doesn't penetrate. But you can see how the DPM is quite nice with the alpha damage, doing 280 for a tier 7 tank with this decent sort of 8-second reload is very nice to have. Especially when you have that good armor profile and mobility, the tank overall just feels very good and consistent in all sorts of situations. If you're out in the open, the armor can still work because your size is small and your weak points are quite hard to hit. You have to thread a needle to sort of hit the lower plate or to hit the turret cheeks. And then the gun overall is just consistent. The only stat it really lacks is penetration, and you can mitigate that by using calibrated shells. And of course, hull down, it's a very good tank. Of course, some tanks in tier 7 are better, like the CS52 Lease for example, but this has the better flat ground armor, so it's just sort of a overall all-rounder tank. There you could see the damage blocking. I blocked 1600 damage, which is very high for a medium tank in tier 7, and also did 2600 damage, which is a pretty good score for tier 7. In that game I didn't have any credit boosters on, so you can see it still makes some decent credits in tier 7. The next battle is on Middelburg. This one you can see there is a hazard 1 on the enemy team. He is stock, so you'll be able to see the stock turret of that tank.
Time to roll out.
Here you can see the mobility on medium terrain. It's not fast, but it's not terrible either. You have to consider that this tank does have reliable armor, which is quite a rarity in tier 7, and it makes this tank quite unique to play.
Enemy armor is hit.
So in this situation I'm just waiting for shots on the enemy, and I try to use HE on the Hellcat, but I've hit his tracks, and that it will be because the HE has less velocity. I was aimed on the hull, but then because the Hellcat started moving back and the shell velocity of HE is less than AP, the shell was only able to hit his tracks as he went around the corner. So now I'm pushing forward, hoping to rely on the armor of my tank. And you can see there the enemy hazard 1 penetrates my lower plate.
Enemy armor destroyed.
And now you'll be able to see the armor of the stock turret. There you can see I get quite lucky with RNG and hitting the weak point in the hazard 1's cheek. Now I have to retreat because I don't want to get shot by a smasher and the ELC on the side. But here you can see how small the turret cheek weak points are on the hazard 1 stock turret. I am getting quite lucky with my RNG and hitting those shots, because that turret is quite actually hard to deal with for tier 7 tanks like this one. But you can see just in this situation the enemy hazard 1's armor is so reliable. I am penetrating them, but note that I am using heat and I'm getting quite lucky with my RNG shooting their turret cheeks and the cupola. The turret is strong and you could see how red it was in that situation. Combine that with the 8 degrees of gun depression that this tank has, it's just very reliable battle.
We're immobilized.
Unfortunately taking a shot from the smasher there. And here you'll see I make a bit of a mistake. I should have really gone for the Churchill, which my other heavy tank was focusing down, but instead I go for this AMX-13, which can kill me in one shot. And he also has 2 shots, so even though his shot can mill, he can kill me. So we are back. The replay crashed, so I had to restart the game, but here's the battle results. You can see in that game I did 3,000 damage. You can see it being held down and using the gun to trade alpha damage and farm, and blocking 1,000, almost 1,500, which for a tier 7 tank that is very good. Usually tier 7 medium tanks don't block damage, and when they do, it's usually not this much. In that game I made quite a few credits, 57,000, again without using a credit booster, but that was slightly boosted with the high caliber medal and the first class mastery. So yeah, the Hazard 1. In my opinion, and to conclude, I believe this is the best tier 7 medium tank in the game at the moment. There are no other tier 7 medium tanks which quite offer the all-round package that this tank can offer. The closest ones to it are the Sphere or the CS52 Lease, but the Sphere lacks the armor, the CS52 Lease lacks the mobility and gun depression. The Hazard 1 is the perfect combination of all the stats a medium tank could need. It has a good hull, it's got a good lower plate, it's got a strong upper plate. Yes, it has a weak point, but its small size helps it with that, and in all fairness, if it didn't have a weak point that would be a really big problem because it would be just broken. But it's got reliable hull armor, which is something most tier 7 medium tanks, actually no tier 7 medium tanks really have, and it's reliable on flat ground, which is even rarer. On top of this, it's got a good turret. Of course, it's not the best. There are better turrets in tier 7, for example the T44-85, but this one's not bad. The turret cheeks are just about enough to resist standard ammo from basically the most common tanks you'll face, which are tier 6 and 7 medium and heavy tanks. And let me just show you, it can bounce tier 7 heavy tanks, for example, if we get a one with more average level of standard penetration. Here's the Juto. You can see the turret is roughly a 50-50 sort of penetration, and that's because it has 180mm of armor, and with enhanced armor on, this tank has 179mm of turret front. But if we take, for example, a lower penetration heavy tank, for example 175, this is still a very common level of penetration in tier 7, and you can see it's still able to bounce with, well, it still has quite a good chance to bounce. But this tank, basically, it's got that reliable armor, and even if you're facing, let's say, a high penetration tank, let's take a tier 8 heavy tank, the T34 is the perfect example, it still has these auto ricochet zones on the top here, above the gun and around the mantlet, so it still has just these troll areas against even the highest penetration enemy, which the T34 is just about the highest penetration level you'll find you'll go up against. But of course that is the rare case where you face a higher tier heavy tank or tank destroyer with high penetration levels. Most of the time you'll be seeing this against the Hazard 1. It has just strong, reliable armor for the tier and the type of tank it faces, which other tanks don't offer. And it doesn't trade anything to have this. It's got a reliable gun, it's got good accuracy, good aim time, good gun handling, great, well, relatively good DPM for its high alpha damage of 280. Its penetration is low, but it's not below average for tier 7. Tier 7s are just low penetration tanks. And it doesn't lose out on mobility. It still has perfectly good mobility for a medium tank. On medium terrain, yes, it slows down a bit compared to hard terrain, but it is still overall good mobility, and in fact, It's slightly more mobile than the CS52 Lease, which has less armor and a worse gun than this. So this tank is just the perfect all-round package. It's got armor on both the hull and the turret. It's got a great gun, and with great alpha, and that is quite good for, dealing with tier 8s, since a lot of the time tier 7 medium tanks just have low alpha and it's hard to deal with higher tier tanks. And of course it's got that pretty decent, good overall mobility. So if you can get this tank this season, if you're playing actively, definitely do try to get this fully upgraded, because it is definitely worth it to have in your garage. It's a great vehicle, and in my opinion it's the best one, the best medium tank in tier 7. So that's it for the Hazard 1. I'll probably try to do these other 2 tanks tomorrow, or if I can today. But yeah, Wargaming didn't give us the tanks early for doing content, so I have to do it after it's released. But these, yeah, that's the Hazard 1. Overall, a great tank. And yeah, thanks for watching.